Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Sunday, 2 August, 2026 years after Jesus, and we're talking about Marxism, philosophy, and economics again. The last episode we did, which was the first in the series, this is the second, was on Sunday, 31 May 2026. It's after office hours. That one was after office hours too. My Sundays have been, well, for almost a year now, devoted to vestry meetings. Much of that has been uh, training other vestry members, aspects of executive administration of the church. And those meetings have quieted down somewhat. I like to think that I made an impact in training, um, and I think that in some ways I have, but of course, that depends on uh, other people's free will and their choices of what to do with the material. But you know what? I have served with some very good people, and including now, and some people in the past have not been very good. But a trial by fire as far as that goes. And anyway, I don't normally record on a Sunday, but everything's set for tomorrow because tomorrow's the Sabbath. All the admin stuff. Sometimes I have to do admin stuff on a Monday, and I don't like it. I don't like, but it's like that passage in the Bible where you have to go get the ox out of the ditch. So the last thing I have to do is get a podcast episode out on the weekend, which I like to do. I like to do at least one during the week and at least one on the weekend, at least two a week. I'm trying for. And it's been, as the kids say, it's been a decade. Is that how they say? A century? No, that it's been a second. It's been a second, a nanosecond, since we did Marxism, Philosophy, and Economics by Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell, pronounced Thomas Sowell. Again, I bought this when I was in high school. I used my paper route money. Uh, I probably got it at Barnes and Noble, or actually maybe Bowles and Wadsworth in Littleton, Colorado, or I got it at Summit Ministries in Manitou Springs. I cannot remember. I do remember they had this at Summit Ministries. I'm not sure exactly where I got it. Something makes me think I got it at Barnes and Noble because at Summit Ministries there was usually a penciled in price here in the front, and there's no penciled in price. So it makes me think I got it at that Barnes and Noble. I had this throughout my Navy career because I bought it in high school, I had it in Navy, I had it in college, and I'm telling you, you're going to really enjoy this. We stopped at page 18, his page 18, which got into chapter 2, the dialectical approach, and we covered some of dialectics, what that is. Now we're going to get into methodology of dialectical approach, starting at page 18. We're going to make a fair use of this, do a transformative reading. We'd like to thank Thomas Sowell for writing it. We'd like to thank Quill Press for making it available. Thank you. Go out and get your copy today. Follow along, guys. Get a physical copy and follow along. Um, at the time, Thomas Sowell's senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, named after a Republican. He has been a professor of economics at leading universities, and he has lectured in Xinjiang, which is Chinese for Singapore, Israel, Switzerland, and Dagua, which is Chinese for Germany, as well as across Meigua, which is Chinese for the United States. So let's keep going. What do you say? Pick you up any time of day. Methodology. In chapter 2, the dialectical approach in Marxism. This is basic political philosophy. Let's go. Thomas Sowell starts by saying, if one wishes to understand the essence and all that is visible is the appearance, then one must abstract from what is visible, analyze the abstraction, and then reason systematically from there in order to get back to a truer understanding of empirical reality. Although superficially common sense might suggest that one commence with the real and concrete, yet on closer consideration, according to Marx, this approach proves to be wrong. Notice, I'm a common sense epistemology guy, and I've mentioned this before, right? I've mentioned it before. Marx is departing from common sense. According to Marx, this approach proves to be wrong. What is the scientifically correct method is to proceed by simplifying the concrete into an abstraction, an imaginary concrete, which becomes less and less complex until we get at the simplest conception. Then, by systematically adding complicating factors, we start on our return journey toward empirical reality. Okay. But this time, not as a chaotic notion of an integral whole, but as a rich aggregate of many conceptions and relations. In short, Marx was a believer in abstraction, systematic analysis, and successive approximations to reality, too complex to grasp directly. It was precisely the complexity and ever-changing phenomena of the real world that made systematic analytic procedures, science necessary. Page 19 at the top. As Marx expressed it, all science would be superfluous if the appearance, the form, and the nature of things were wholly identical. The same point was made both in Marx's correspondence and in the third volume of Capital. Marx based his approach on the Hegelian method of advancing from the abstract to the concrete. While disapproving the way Hegel presented it, right? Right? Abstract deductive analysis is necessary because everyday experience, according to Marx, catches only the delusive appearance of things. Marx's economic analysis, especially in Capital, was constructed in this pattern of systematic successive approximations. In the preface to the first volume of Capital, Marx asserted, quote, in the analysis of economic forms, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of use. The force of abstraction must replace both, unquote. In the first volume of Capital, Marx also referred to various puzzling economic phenomena which could not be dealt with at the level of abstraction there under the many simplifying assumptions of that volume, but which would be explained later in the third volume, where many of these assumptions were eliminated. This echoed the approach in his earlier book, Critique of Political Economy, where at the beginning Marx warned that there would be no anticipation of results, which depended on later stages of the argument. Conversely, at the beginning of the third volume of Capital, after all the preparatory analysis that went before, Marx said that the phenomena to be discussed now would approach step by step that form which they assume on the surface of society in their mutual interactions, in competition, and in the ordinary consciousness of the human agencies in this process. The analysis had advanced from the inner essence to the outward appearance. Page 20 at the top. Marx's methodological criticisms of the classical economics underscored the importance he attached to successive approximations and to consistently operating at one level of abstraction at a time. Of Adam Smith, he said, and this is a large block quote, on the one hand, he traces the interconnection between the economic categories or the hidden structure of the bourgeois economic system. This is about Adam Smith. On the other hand, alongside this interconnection, he sets up also the connection as it is manifested in the phenomena of competition, and therefore as it presents itself to the unscientific observer as well as to the man who is preoccupied and interested from a practical standpoint in the process of bourgeois production. These two modes, continuing quote of Marx about Adam Smith, these two modes of approach in Adam Smith's work not only run unconstrainedly side by side, but are interwoven and continuously contradict each other, the one penetrating to the inner relations, this physiology, as it were, of the bourgeois system, the other only describing, cataloging, expounding, and bringing under classifying definitions the external phenomena of the process of everyday life in their outward manifestation and appearance, unquote. Here comes Sowell again. Even the more analytically rigorous David Ricardo did not escape similar criticism from Marx. For while Ricardo is accused of being too abstract, the opposite accusation would be more justified, i.e., lack of the power to abstract, to stay on one level of abstraction without bringing in factors belonging to a different level. For example, Marx considered it a mistake on Ricardo's part to have discussed the modification of his value theory before reaching the stage of the argument where the modifying factors had been analyzed. Marx credited the classical economics, a term he coined, with delving below the surface, however inconsistently. Page 21 at the top of Chapter 2, Dialectical Approach in Marxism, Philosophy, and Economics by Thomas Sowell. Page 21. He coined another term, vulgar economists, for those whose analysis deals with appearances only and seeks plausible explanations of the most obtrusive phenomena. As Marx outlined his own projected work on capital in a letter to Engels, he pointed out that only in the third volume would he reach the forms of appearance which serve as the starting point in the vulgar conception. So he doesn't like common sense. As Marx was preparing to publish the first volume of Capital, Engels pointed out that the Philistine is not accustomed to this sort of abstract thought, and that the points here established dialectically might be better presented in some other way in order to avoid some terribly shallow objections that would be made. Marx replied that changing the presentation in order to silence all objections based on misunderstandings of his abstract approach would ruin the whole dialectical method of development. Some people would indeed misunderstand, he agreed, because only the intermediate form in which relationships appear is always reflected in their brain. Oh, man. And not in their inner connection. If it were possible to see directly the interconnections, the essence, then what would be the need for science at all? After Capital was published and the objections predicted by Engels began to appear, Marx said of one reviewer, quote, as against the disclosures of the inner connection, he proudly claims that in appearance things look different. In fact, he is boasting that he holds fast to the appearance and takes it for the last word. Why then any science at all? Unquote. Let me make an epistemological point, which is really basic. Okay. It's not advanced, it's just basic. You'll notice a tension between appearances and reality, between common sense, which he calls the vulgar conception, and science. Don't forget that. Don't forget that. Now, the next section is called Ethics, page 21 at the bottom. In the early days of Marx and Engels, when they expected revolution at any moment, they were preoccupied with polemical writings in anticipation of a new society. Decades later, this is under the subsection called Ethics, which is a subsection called Methodology. Well, sorry. Okay. We're in chapter 2, which is called the Dialectical Approach. The first subsection is called Dialectics, which we covered last time, 31 May 2026. The second subsection is called Methodology, which we're covering today. Within methodology, the first subsection is called Ethics. Okay. Bottom page 21. Get a physical copy and follow along. Okay, now, in the early days of Marx and Engels, when they expected revolution at any moment, I'm rolling my eyes there, they were preoccupied with polemical writings in anticipation of a new society. Decades later, after many disappointments, there was time for leisurely discussion of basic philosophical questions. Page 22 at the top. By this time, Marx was physically spent and unable to complete his magnum opus, Capital. It was, however, one of Engels' most fruitful periods, continuing on past Marx's death, so that much of the philosophical, including ethical writings of Marxism, are by Engels. This raises the question already alluded to in chapter 1, whether or to what extent Engels' writings at this period distort the basic ideas of Karl Marx. Unfortunately, Engels' most extensive discussions of ethical issues occurred in his anti-de Ring. I don't know how to say it. Gretchen, help me out. A book whose manuscript he read to Marx in its entirety, and to which, in fact, Marx contributed a chapter. The issue of a possible deviation by Engels is thus minimized for this particular work, one of their last joint writings, though published solely under Engels' name. Perhaps more to the point, the ethical views expressed in Anti-Der Ring are completely consistent with other views expressed by Marx and Engels in other writings. In a lecture delivered in 1865, Marx declared, "What you think is just or equitable, what you think is just or equitable is out of the question. According to Marx, the question is what is necessary and unavoidable with a given system of production." Later, in the first volume of Capital, Marx asked, "What avails lamentations in the face of historical necessity?" Though he made the criticism of capitalism his life's work, Marx also saw a transitory necessity for the capitalist mode of production. The individual capitalist had to be judged morally within the framework of this stage of history. Now, you see that the moral judgment is within a framework at this stage of history, so it's relativized. Okay, so what's the ultimate grounding then of morality, a moral judgment? Let's continue on here. Page 22 at the bottom. Quote, this is quoting Marx. My standpoint from which the evolution of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he remains, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. Unquote. What's he saying in that quote? If you have an idea, put it in the comments. I want to hear. What's he saying in that quote? He mentions evolution. Society is a product of natural history, purely natural, no supernatural, right? Now, I mean, a lot of times when you think of ethics, you think of supernatural basis for that. Think of the Ten Commandments. God says, "Thou shalt not murder." God says, "Thou shalt not steal." Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you," right? If any man merely looks at a woman lustfully, he has committed adultery. Okay, so there's a supernatural ethical basis, right? Right? Marx is saying no. No, it's a product of natural history, it's evolution. And so the individual cannot be possibly responsible for the relations whose creature he remains. The top of page 23. Engels provided a systematic exposition of the principles behind such statements. The great basic thought of Hegel, according to Engels, was that the world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes. Once this central notion of dialectics is grasped, the demand for final solutions and eternal truths ceases. So in other words, remember they're writing in like Europe, right, where there's Christianity and a lot of belief in divine source of morality and moral judgments. And they're saying the quest for eternal truth in the supernatural on morality or anything else ceases. Quoting Engels, quote, each stage is necessary and therefore justified for the time and conditions to which it owes its origin, But in the face of new, higher conditions which gradually develop in its own womb, it loses its validity and justification. For it, dialectical philosophy, nothing is final, absolute, sacred. Unquote. Nothing is sacred. Nothing is final. Nothing is absolute. All right. All right. Remember, this is under the subheading of ethics under methodological methodology. Back to Sowell. Historical justification is thus the only justification, geez, the supreme ethical principle in Marx and Engels. Um, Now, you would think that commonsensically, ethics is a different subject than history, or ethics is a different subject than natural science. You might say the hard sciences, sometimes people say, but the natural science, the science that studies the natural world. You would think. But he just took, remember, he doesn't like common sense. So if common sense would say that, then he's suspicious of it. So he collapses what is commonsensical about ethics, and he says, no, no, there's no justification of right and wrong. Like if you make a decision, you do it, let you do an action, and you have justification for it within philosophy. I mean, ethics is a part of philosophy. And so you have an argument, you provide evidence for why you believe what you did is right and why that's right or virtuous or an expression of good character or according to one's duty or the commandments or provides better consequences than the other options and so on and so forth. But what Sowell is saying is that they're collapsing ethics into history. This quotation that Sowell says is historical justification is the only justification. But what does that even mean? His history makes arguments, but it's not about right and wrong. That's not the topic of history. I mean, I'm talking from common sense. The topic of history is what happened in the past and what does it mean and what's the meaning of it for our life today. That's the topic of history. Right and wrong is not really the same topic. And this can be very confusing. So when I teach philosophy, I talk about the philosophy of second order inquiries, right? Philosophy of science, philosophy of art, philosophy of education, and philosophy of history. And so the historian doing history does bring philosophical assumptions, just like the scientist brings philosophical assumptions. So that's why you have to study philosophy of science. You have to study the artist brings philosophical assumptions to art. You have to study the philosophy of art. The educator brings philosophical assumptions. That's why you got to study the philosophy of education. And the historian, too, oftentimes makes moral judgments as they're doing history. Good. But just the point is that history itself is not the same thing as ethics as a subject matter. Okay. I'm saying commonsensically. I'm a fan of common sense, but Marx and Engels are saying historical justification is the only justification, according to Sowell here. The concept of historical justification runs throughout their writings. Even slavery and incest were considered to be historically justified at given stages of history. Okay, I'm going to make a comment about that too. Even slavery and incest. Remember, Thomas Sowell is black, right? Remember? A black Republican. Tom, I'm going to call you a Republican. I know you're probably squirming, but you at night when your head hits the pillow, you agree with me. Slavery and incest. Okay, commonsensically wrong, right? Common sense morality, according to common sense morality. Remember, they're rejecting common sense. They appear to be wrong. He's writing, remember, this 1865 was the last date that was mentioned. What was happening in 1865 in the United States? Lincoln was trying to crush slavery, and it didn't work out very well because he was assassinated by a Democrat from and then a Democrat from Tennessee took over the presidency and started moving backwards. Later that year, the Ku Klux Klan was born. So the Klan agrees. The Democrats in this time of period, they agree with Marx. Yeah, yeah, we are justified. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And who knows how many of them were doing incest? I don't know. But my point is that this uh, Soul takes paradigm examples of wrong from a common sense perspective and says even these commonsensically paradigmatic examples of wrong conduct, slavery and incest, according to Marx and Engels, who do not agree with common sense morality or common sense anything, say, oh yeah, that could be justified historically. And what does that mean? It can be justified historically. Well, since there is no separate justification in ethics other than history, then it can be justified ethically because ethical justification is historical justification. They're the same thing. There's no difference between ethics and history. Continuing with Thomas Sowell, Adam Smith's method of economic reasoning, though severely criticized by Marx, was nevertheless considered by him to be historically justified. See, he's a relativist. There's no truth. I mean, this is very hard to unpack and articulate because it's actually crazy. So if you say something crazy, it's going to sound crazy. And it might sound like I'm being unfair to him. You just made him sound crazy. Well, but if that's what he's saying, I'm being fair. He's a relativist. Truth is relative to historically held beliefs, which is another way of saying that as soon as you come to believe something in a historical period and you go along with the crowd, it's justified for you. So, what kind of relativism is this? I think it's not just doxastic relativism, which is a relativism of belief, or epistemic relativism. Um, you're justified in believing something relative to what appears true to you or a lot of people at a certain given period of time in a historical era. I think he's actually an alethic relativist, which would aletheia in Greek is the word for truth. I think he believes there is no such thing as truth, commonsensically, but truth is reduced to belief. Beliefs held by who? Whose beliefs? Beliefs in a historical era. It's not really that clear exactly what he's saying to me. But when you say historical justification, something can be justified historically, it seems like you're saying that the evidence that something is true is relative to a given time period, but the deeper reason for that is because truth itself is relative to another time period, which is another way of saying that truth doesn't really exist. The way you think of truth doesn't really exist. You have to redefine it to mean belief, which is definitely not uh, common sense. Well, anyway, let's keep going here. Adam Smith, and now this is Thomas Sowell again. Adam Smith's method of economic reasoning, though severely criticized by Marx, was nevertheless considered by him to be historically justified. Here's a block quote. He is justified in doing this because, this is Marx, if we accept a few of his special inquiries, such as that into money, his task was in fact a double one. On the one hand, to attempt to penetrate to the inner physiology of bourgeois society, on the other, partly for the first time to describe the living forms in which this inner physiology manifests itself outwardly, to show its relations as they appear on the surface, and partly also to find a nomenclature and the corresponding abstract ideas for these phenomena, and therefore partly also for the first time to reproduce them in language and in the process of thought. Okay. The one task interests him as much as the other. Remember, this is Marx about Adam Smith. And as both proceed independently of the other, the result is a completely contradictory way of looking at things. One, on page 24 at the top, that more or less directly expresses their intrinsic relations, the other with equal justice and without any internal relationship, with no connection at all to the other way of examining the subject, expressing the relations in their outward appearance, unquote. Okay, Sowell again. But because Adam Smith was considered to be historically justified in 1776 does not mean that his followers in the middle of the 19th century were still justified in continuing these inconsistencies. That's according to Marx. Similarly, early socialist writers such as Robert Owen, Fourier, and Saint Simon were highly praised by Marx and Engels, while the latter-day disciples of these utopian socialists were unmercifully castigated. Scathing Marxian criticisms of later utopian socialists among their contemporaries have misled some modern interpreters into concluding that Marx and Engels had contempt for Owen, Fourier, and Saint Simon. Nothing could be further from the truth. As Engels said, and here's a block quote, if in Saint Simon we find the breadth of a genius, thanks to which almost all of the ideas of later socialists, which are not strictly economic, are contained in his works in embryo, in Fourier we find a critique of existing social conditions, which typically French in its wit is nonetheless penetrating. Unquote. Back to Sowell. Robert Owen was likewise a born leader of men, according to Engels. Utopian socialists were utopians because they could be nothing else at a time when capitalist production was as yet so little developed. They were historically justified. In looking back on them, it is possible to delight in the inspired ideas and germs of ideas which everywhere emerged through their covering of fantasy. In much the same vein, the Communist Manifesto spoke of the original utopian socialists as revolutionary, but of their latter-day followers as mere reactionary sects. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels spoke of Fourier's masterly observations on education and of his theories in general as containing a vein of true poetry, but dismissed his orthodox disciples as the antipodes of Fourier. In the middle of the 19th century, utopian socialism was no longer considered historically justified. All right. So you have this concept of historical justification. I'm not sure how I would have liked to have a more critical examination of what historical justification even means, but we're going to have to take it as it comes. After all, he's got all this work to do, and the whole point is to make this accessible. So I think he's just trying to get that out there. And I think what he's trying, and he's also trying to be fair to Marx and not criticize him, but explain him, which is hard to do when to explain just sounds like you're criticizing. I mean, if you're doing it correctly. And I think that relativism is self-defeating. So if he's a relativist, that's going to be a problem. We're on page 25, and the next subsection is called Development and Alienation. In chapter 2 of Marxism, which is called the Dialectical Approach. And development and alienation will go into Marxian versus Hegelian dialectics. And then I think we have a summary after that. So let's see here. We the chapter ends at at page 35. So we'll have about 10 pages left. Let me see if I want to push into this at all. Um, I think I'm going to stop there. I think that's enough for today. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. It's Sunday, 2 August, 2026, years after Jesus. It's 4:57. Oh yeah, I'm definitely stopping there because it's almost beer o'clock. Today's a work day for me because I work for the church. 4:57 p.m. And we went from page 18. Okay. All right. We've been interacting with this wonderful scholar named Thomas Sowell. Praise God. 2 August 2026, Sunday, to page 25. So we went from pages 18 to 25. I was listening to my grandpa died last year at 102 years old. As he would say, 102 years young. And we miss him terribly. His name is James Mather. Well, my grandpa Mather was an entrepreneur. He started a number of companies. I'm not even sure exactly how many, but there was one main one that he's famous for, which is called Mr. Steak. And it was a franchisor company, and he had franchisees, 286 restaurants in the United States and Canada, based in Denver, Colorado. And this went on for decades in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And there's there's a Facebook page called "I Worked at a Mr. Steak Restaurant," which has I don't know how many people, thousands, I think, from all across the country, all walks of life, different ages. I mean, obviously not too diverse in age because there are people that worked there. And from this group, I can't remember, but one lady in particular reached out to me. I never worked at a Mr. Steak restaurant, but it was my grandpa, right? So I'm I'm in this group, and this lady reached out to me who owned seven of the restaurants, and she offered to send me some tapes, some audio tapes of Grandpa from the 1970s and 80s, radio interviews, talks he gave, um, that were recorded. And so I backed up one of them was a radio interview from 1982 yesterday. And I did another one today. I'm going to do one every day until they're done. Today was from 1977. And my grandpa is a total Republican. I'm thinking about publishing them on the Republican Professor and making them episodes. Um, Today's was about um, the book. It was an interaction with, from a biblical perspective, an interaction with the book called um, something. His name was Allen. The author was named Allen. Um, well, I've got it right here. I should just take a look at it. I did this. I did this tape today, and it's called "As a Man Thinketh." So it's kind of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of thing, like emphasizing willpower, also the grace and mercy of the Lord Jesus Christ and God in your life. But basically, paying careful attention to developing the right habits of mind and thought so that your life goes well to the extent possible, and avoiding the trappings of poverty, dysfunction, despair, so on and so forth, that can really take over a not only an individual's life, a family's life, a neighborhood, a city, a state, a country. Totally anti-Marxist. Yesterday's was backing up this. Thank you, Carrie, by the way, Carrie Marquardt. Thank you, who owned the Cheyenne restaurant, as she wrote right here. Um, Yesterday's was Tom Bowman, KRAE Radio Cheyenne, interview with Jim Mather, Mr. Steak. Tuesday, 23 March 1983. Sorry, 1982. This was about the free enterprise system. So Grandpa was, I mean, remember the Soviet Union was still a menacing threat, had just invaded Afghanistan just a few years before in 1979. The Iran Socialist Revolution had taken over. Remember, we had dodged a bullet with Carter and with Ford, and Reagan had won, and we had high interest rates, and we had a stagnation happening, a recession happening. There were some very real challenges in coming out of the malaise of the 1970s. The uh, the the No one would have predicted that the Soviet Union would not exist in 10 years at that time. But so Grandpa, as an entrepreneur, was railing against communism, and it's so encouraging to see. So I really think I'm going to publish those. And Grandpa was the one that sent me to Summit Ministries, where they had this book to purchase on the table, even though I think I got this particular copy at Barnes and Noble, as I said before. But the reason I think that is because there's no price written in pencil. And the other books that I have, like, for example, Red Cocaine, I should show you this. I want to show you this red cocaine. Um, Let me see if it's within reach. Uh, because I have the one I bought at Summit Ministries. Where is it? I think it's over there. Well, it's the books always had a little mark indicating the price. Well, anyway, maybe I'll talk about Summit Ministries another time. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. We'll see you next time. It's 2 August 2026, years after Jesus. It's a Sunday. It's now 5:05 p.m. It's beer o'clock officially. God bless you guys. Take care.